now we have these 15 minutes to discuss and to deepen in some of the topics that you have raised during your interventions. If no one tells me, I have some questions to ask just to open this debate. First of all, I was thinking well, first, corporate social responsibility has been, to my knowledge, a sort of fact sheet with some checks that you had to explain or comply or explain, and that was it. Now ESG seems to work as a strategy, as criteria and activity, and there's some sort of information beforehand to stakeholders that has to be given. Then there's a sort of performance of the company, and then some results. So time is a key element in this new way to assess sustainability and social responsibility. So, and the other question that came to my mind was towards whom we want to make accountable companies. So soft law or hard law, again, appear here. So my question would be, how could we define an ESG strategy? So what would be the best procedure that you find for that? Maybe with the Corporate Governance Code, soft law, or the Section 172, hard law. So what would be the best way to help this strategy, to make it happen for companies? Another question that comes to my mind for all the members of the panel is, what does social in ESG mean? Because we've been talking about the environment, and there's been plenty of information about governance, but social, maybe it's the most difficult, and I don't want to open a Pandora box, but I need to ask, what is this social element, and how can we measure and pay attention to this one? And a special question for Professor Möslein. He has been talking about a hybrid regime, and what if there is a contradiction between the information that the public certification has and the private one? Wouldn't this hybrid model impair companies' performance at the side of this maybe small contradiction, but how could this be improved, or if you have thought about it? Thank you so much. So you can just tell via chat who wants to speak first, and then we will share this time. Who wants?
There's a simple rule, ladies first, I would suppose.
Okay, perfect. So thank you. You can start, Florian.
Okay. I'm not ladies.
You say ladies.
So
I missed that.
I said ladies first, but I am so polite to start first and let you end. Okay, thank you very much for these questions. I start with the social question. In fact, I think all different elements of the ESG are difficult to define. If you look at the European taxonomy, also the ecological factor is difficult. You could focus either on climate change, or you could focus on natural resources, on like the classical ecological pollution issues. So it's not that easy either. But you are right that the social elements are difficult as well. And if you look at the criteria of the existing certification regimes, for instance, you cannot see it now. You can see it. For instance, at the catalog that the B Corp regime provides, they focus on questions on how workers are treated, like their wages, how much they get paid, but also how much they have to say in the company, and also on criteria like equal payment for men and women and so forth. Now the problem is that this, of course, interacts with legal provisions in various countries. And B Corp has a very global reach. They want to establish their regime on a global level. But if you look at their criteria, some of the criteria are lower than the legal criteria that apply in Europe and more particularly in Germany. In particular, when co-determination is concerned, but also with respect to many other labor law questions. So that's a bit weird. If you want to get a certification, you would expect that companies perform better than what they are legally requirement, and therefore it does not interact very well with these national legal provisions. Second question, hybrid regime and whether such hybrid regime would impair the company's performance. To be honest, I don't see such risk, or at least I don't see how a hybrid regime would have different consequences on companies' performance as compared to a entirely private or an entirely public regime. You have to take into account that companies are in principle not, there's no mandatory obligation to get a certification. So it's a opt-in regime. What makes it hybrid is only that the certifiers, the private certifiers, are supervised and are authorized by public entities. And that is a mechanism that provides for more trustworthy certification institutions, that makes the certification regime more trustworthy, but that does not have any negative effects on the companies themselves, I would argue. But I'm absolutely open to other arguments, and I would in fact be very interested to learn about them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Florian. Then.
Thank you. I'm happy to go next, seeing that I missed the previous invitation to do that. Thank you so much for the questions. I would like perhaps to comment on two of the things that you've mentioned. The first one is when you referred to CSR and the comply or explain approach, and specifically referring to CSR sort of being a tick box exercise, just a list where you tick off what you've done in that regard. I think maybe just one point to make there that I do find quite interesting in this regard is, and a way perhaps to prevent a sort of tick box approach, is instead of a comply or explain approach to move to an apply and explain approach. Mm-hmm. So you actually have to apply the principles and then explain it. So this is something that's been introduced in the new stewardship code in the UK, and it's also seen in other jurisdictions, for instance, in the King Report in South Africa, where they opted for the apply and explain approach, which did from some empirical studies and views from literature and so on, seems to be working quite well, where you have the sort of broader principles being applied. So things like you need to have an ethical board. That is something that you of course will apply with. And then the more detail you actually explain, and you have much fewer principles in your code. So I think that is quite a good mechanism dealing with the tick box approach. So that's maybe one point to make. The second one to just give a brief comment on is your question relating to soft law versus hard law, and sort of what is the best approach to follow, specifically with regards to stakeholder recognition. Now, my view has always been that a hybrid approach is the best approach to follow, and specifically if you look at this from sort of a local or national perspective, I think a combination of hard law and soft law is a good way to deal with this. If you look at the UK, for instance, as an example, you have your Companies Act with your Section 172, which obviously has some shortcomings, but that is then sort of linked with the strategic reporting requirements that we referred to before. So the hard law is really a mix of having your enlightened shareholder value approach in the Companies Act and then your mandatory reporting requirements. Now, some of the non-financial issues, obviously, the reporting is on a comply or explain basis and others on a mandatory basis, but that's very much embedded in hard law. You then, of course, have your soft law element, and with the UK being characterized by being a flexible model, you have the comply or explain approach mainly in the corporate governance code. I think one way, and that's what we've argued before as well, to go a bit further than that's the current position in the UK is to make provision for stakeholder engagement and to actually do that on a mandatory basis rather than just a comply or explain basis. But that will still be in line with the hybrid approach that's been followed. And once again, you can refer to some other jurisdictions where they actually do have mandatory board committee dealing with CSR or social responsibility type issues, and they are making it mandatory for certain companies, linking it, for instance, to the turnover of the company, the number of employees, and so on. And it seems to be working quite well in those jurisdictions. So yes, those are mainly the two main points that I would like to emphasize at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. Thank you so much.
So if I can come in on a couple of aspects, Patricia, and maybe address your high-level question on accountability. So my view would be that we need to define the accountability by reference to all of the stakeholders. But what we have tended to see over time with the movement from CSR to ESG is that the focus has moved much more to accountability towards shareholders, because the reliance on the financial track for implementing ESG really means that the role of stakeholders is marginalized. And if that continues, and I think the effect has been to narrow the concept of corporate accountability in a way that is perhaps not really very well aligned with the broader objectives of corporate social responsibility. So, I would see some move back towards the old style CSR focus as being quite beneficial. And secondly, focused on your question around what is the meaning of the S in ESG, I think the way that I would approach that would be to say that, S is the residual which represents the stakeholder interests that are not represented by E and G. So some stakeholder interests are represented by E and G, and they those have been, in terms of actions and implementations, those have been the main focus of attention. The reason that S has been ignored is precisely for the reason that I just stated, that what ESG has done is it's hollowed out the S. And, what we need to think about is how do we go back to thinking about mechanisms that will fill out the S more effectively for the future. And I think that's a challenge that we will have to face. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And Francisco?
I'd like to address the ESG strategy question. So I wouldn't say that there is just a perfect ESG strategy question. It really depends what kind of investor you are. Mm-hmm. So, looking at the spectrum of capital, are you a sustainable investor that you're looking for addressing ESG risks but looking at financial return? Are you an impact investor that you're taking also into account ESG opportunities to increase your financial returns? Or on the other hand, you're a philanthropic investor that you don't really care about your returns, but you are only looking to do good for society or environment. So it depends what your strategy, what your objectives are in terms of investment. You would implement one or other ESG strategy that fits with your investment beliefs.
Thank you. Sorry. Continue.
In terms of the regulatory framework, I entirely agree that a hybrid system would be the most appropriate in this case. The new European regulation is being criticized for being a little bit rigid, and so as I mentioned earlier, the ESG space is not binary. You can't really say yes and no. There is a lot more to look at. So the rigidity of hard law, I don't think it would be very helpful. And addressing the social part of it, I think is becoming more and more important, especially with this pandemic going on. And looking at the SDGs, which is, I think the way going forward. Human rights, human capital, and how the companies are managing these risks, and especially how the board is doing the oversight of these risks policies. That would be the key social areas to look at.
Thank you so much, Francisco, for your input. And thank everyone, attendance, online attendance, and presential ones. Thanks for being here. It's been a luxury to share this hour in the morning and to listen to your contributions. I've learned a lot, and I'm quite interested in seeing further developments. Thank you so much. We have now a break, and next session will take place in half an hour.